Anyway, our speaker today is Dr. Norman Saul. We all know Norman. He's a regular here, and I won't tell you all of the biography that I have here, but I will highlight a couple of things. Dr. Saul has written sort of the definitive history of Russian-American relations, a series of books that concentrates on various periods in Russian-American relations, and he's kept himself really very involved in different activities and projects involving a number of different authors writing on various aspects of Russian-American relations. So one example of that is the book that I've left over there that was published just recently and called New Perspectives on Russian-American Relations, involving a number of different authors, both Russian and American, writing several chapters or contributions to that. And then also, and he may tell you more about this, Slavica Publishers putting together an entire series of books devoted to eyewitnesses' accounts, mostly of the Russian Revolution or entirely of the Russian Revolution.
Yes.
And several of the people, aside from Norman, we've got several different authors who are going to be working on this here in Lawrence, and so we can look forward to Norman.
Okay. Thank you, Bart. And I feel privileged to be starting off what appears to be a really good semester of guest speakers. And since I happen to have a book by one of them, I will pass it around and mention him. This is David Mould, who will be coming in March. And I knew him when he was here as a graduate student in the 1970s. He was in journalism, but we had some interests in common and got together and talked, and I renewed acquaintance with him just last year, and mainly on the basis of a book that he wrote and came out this past year, and I'll pass it around. He had spent some time in Central Asia and in media studies, which covers a variety of activities, I think, advising new television media operations and studies of media in universities there, communications in other words. And he'll be coming from Ohio Universities. He's also emeritus like myself. But I'm looking forward to seeing him once again here in Lawrence, and he'll be talking about an interesting person who is from Kansas and was in Russia during the Revolution, probably one of the more conspicuous people of Americans, who carried a motion picture camera around with him on the streets of Petrograd during the Revolution. And so if you see any films of the Revolution, it's his. He was the only one. This project paper, which I gave in Washington at the conference this past year, is one of a case of discovery, loss, rediscovery. It goes back a ways. As some of you may know, that I've been cleaning out books and other things and stacks of drafts of papers and everything. And in the middle of all that, I discovered this paper that I had forgotten about. And so I discovered, well, why don't I do something with this since it's never been published? It was a sort of an extension of a paper that I did do and published, but never got around to doing this one, finishing it. And so I decided that it ought to be, and I found it was pretty much finished. And so all I had to do was tidy it up and maybe send it off somewhere. But right now it's in the presentation stage. And this is the title of but it changes from week to week, the title. Alaska Studies has been, I think, a field that I'm not very familiar with, but I'm getting back into, I guess. And John has been instrumental in getting a book here, which I'll be reviewing for another operation that's ongoing, the Journal of Russian American Studies, which is an e-journal, which is managed, hosted by the University of Kansas Libraries. John knows about this, and I'm going to be reviewing this book. But I just picked it up yesterday or the day before. And the title is Married to the Empire, 3 Governors' Wives in Russian America. I haven't started it yet, but it sounds very interesting. You get a female perspective in Alaska of Russian America. So they're not really Russian. They're they're Finnish, Swedish, Baltic German. But anyway, that's the story of the Russian Empire. And I'll pass this around. Married to the Empire. I have a little question about it, John, though, that I don't know that it should be classified under Alaska in the in the library, because it's all about Russians, Russian America. But we won't quarrel about that. One of the things that I got into with this topic, and it was a surprise. It came off out of the blue, really, as a source. And the first one there is what is in the Curious Disappearance of Papers. Beverly C. Sanders' papers, which are cited a lot in this paper, and in the book, another paper. I'll pass this around too. This was the original article that I wrote back in 1972 in the Maryland Historical Magazine. Who's going to find it? I don't know. But anyway, that's where it came out, because he was from Baltimore. And it seemed appropriate that I would submit it to some local magazine like that. And it's listed there at the bottom of the page. Beverly C. Sanders and the Expansion of American Trade in Russia. This happened when I was teaching in Rhode Island, about 1967, I guess, 50 years ago. A woman came up to me at a cocktail party and said, "I hear you're in Russian history. I have a couple of boxes of papers of an ancestor who went to Russia during the Crimean War. Would you like to see them?" Well, why not? And so a couple of weeks later, they showed up in cardboard boxes on my front porch. And I, of course, got interested in Beverly C. Sanders. I never heard of before, or his trip to Russia, certainly. And so I began to work on him. And that was the result of the article that was passing around. And became interested in the whole idea of someone from Baltimore going to San Francisco during the gold rush. He was a 49er. He was going out there but not to look for gold, or to go out in the field, but to service those who were out there. He established a bank. He set up a store. He got into utilities, commodities. He became the president, the first president of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, which is still ongoing, but he was the first. So he was in there in the business world. And of course, San Francisco was booming out of the gold rush in this period. And so that's where a lot of the papers pertain to. But he also got involved in going to Russia, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But that was what inspired me to continue it. Now, another thing that comes out, and I hate to sort of go into family history or family connections, but it happened that my great-grandfather went to California in the gold rush. He dropped out of college in southern Ohio, Otterbein, and where he was living nearby, and went down the Ohio River, up the Missouri to Omaha, and then overland through Nebraska, Utah. He stopped for a while, and he was with a group, with his brother too, so he wasn't going alone, and stopped in the Mormon territory. How do I know all that? Well, he published he had a journal, which has been mimeographed. I have a copy of it, so I know what happened, how he got to California, and how the incidents along the road getting there. Unfortunately, the journal stops when he gets there. He got busy mining for gold, and he did pretty well, he and his brother. They didn't have to walk back to Ohio or anywhere. He took the Panama steamer back through Panama up the Mississippi, ended up in Indiana buying a tract of land, which I was born on and grew up on there, a piece of it that was portioned out to his siblings and grandchildren and so forth. So that's John Neff. John Neff I never knew. He died the year I was born, 97, I think, at the time. But his portrait is on my living room wall, so I can't forget him. He's there. And I remember this. And there's other information I have in my files, a clipping from a newspaper, a local newspaper, of an interview, because people locally knew about his going to California in the gold rush and making it, doing pretty well, and coming and buying land in Indiana. And so that inspired me too. I mean, I knew someone who went to California, and here was another person who went to California, Beverly Sanders. But okay, skip 50 years. I want to dust off this paper. And so I look around. Where is it? Where are they? Fortunately, I'd made copies when I had them in my hands, and of what I thought was important. So I've got those. But what happened to the Sanders papers? Now, at the time that I knew the family that had them, I very much encouraged them to put them in the public domain. And there were several options. There was the Rhode Island Historical Society. There was the Maryland Historical Society. There was the Brown University Archives. And I checked all these. No sign of any Sanders papers. I checked and checked as much as I had time to, and tried to track down the family. And all I ran into was obituaries, so that they're gone, apparently. And apparently the papers are gone with them. I don't know what happened to them. It's one of those cases of something ending up in a compost box or something. They're gone, I guess. Maybe somebody can find them, but they're not. I couldn't find them in any public record source, the Sanders papers. But they're cited in this paper, and it leaves you with a little dilemma, because who's going to sign them, or who's going to find them or be able to check them out? Other sources I then got into and found a surprising amount of material. One thing leads to another. You know, once you find something like the Sanders paper, then you have to be checking around. Well, they're the records of the Russian-America Company. This period that Sanders was involved in the Russian-America. Well, maybe I better make Sanders' connection clear. Being in San Francisco, being a banker, being involved as a prominent businessman, he wanted to know commercial opportunities. Well, commodities. He was into gas. He was an officer of a gas company. This is coal gas, but people lighted their homes with coal gas in San Francisco. And what else do you need in San Francisco? A nasty three-letter word. It's not oil. What?
Liquor.
Liquor is certainly connection, but it's not a three-letter word. 3 letters. What do you need if you have a mint julep on your...
Water. Fizz. Ice.
Ice, you got it. Well, you know that San Francisco doesn't have ice. It's a temperate climate. There's no ice in San Francisco. But where is there ice? Alaska. And the first ice that was brought into San Francisco came from Boston. Now, can you imagine this? This is before there's a Panama Canal. You got to go around the Horn, up, crossing the equator twice. How much ice do you have left? It's sold for $1 a pound. That was a lot of money in those days. And it makes mint juleps very expensive because you can't have one without ice. So, this is the beginnings of a search for wealth and a common commodity. In other words, ice business. And so they knew about Alaska and the Russians being there in the 1950s, and a couple of inquiries were already made. Actually, there was a couple of people, a company from Portland, Oregon, that first went up there and said, "Hey, can you sell us some ice?" Well, it's not so easy. You know, you have to prepare it. You can't just go out there and dig it up on a long haul basis. And so Sanders got involved in this, and others did too. And they established what was become known as the American-Russian Commercial Company, headquartered in San Francisco. And they had other ideas too. Well, Alaska has other things, don't they, besides ice? They have wood, they have fish, they have furs, they have other things. So it was going to be a bigger company than it ended up. They tried these other things like fish and wood. Well, there's plenty of forest around San Francisco, so that wouldn't work. And then it turned out there's plenty of fish there too. So, and the Russian salting of fish did not suit the San Francisco diet, I guess. That's what that was one of the sources. Anyway, the records of the Russian America Company were an important source, and they're here, readily available in microfilm, not at this library, but at other libraries. And when we bought Alaska, we also bought the papers that were there. And so they're American papers, but they were Russian papers, and they cover the period from the beginnings to the end, 1867. And they're in the record group, and on the microfilm, microcopy 11, one of the earlier microfilms of the National Archives. And I might add a footnote to that, is there were a lot of other records of the Russian America Company in Russia at the headquarters of the company in St. Petersburg. But most of these seem to be lost. Nobody's been able to track them down. Few fragments, pieces from people belonging to the company who were part of the company that show up. diplomatic post records. This is a real surprise. There's a lot of records from the American Embassy tracking or looking at what was going on that are kept at the embassy itself, reports that come in that circulate within the embassy or between the embassy and consulates. And they're an important source too. They're not on microfilm, they're in Record Group 84, the National Archives. And what is on microfilm are the official dispatches that were sent back to Washington, which cover some of the same thing, but not nearly as much as in Record Group 84, which is a huge collection. That's why it's not been microfilmed, I guess. Then San Francisco port records. Well, I never thought to look there, but sure enough, if you want to know what was going on in and out of San Francisco, at least of foreign trade, you go to look at Bureau of Customs records, San Francisco port. And it so happened that Beverly Sanders was collector of the port of San Francisco during part of this period. And so his name surfaces. And they kept track of all the ships coming in and out, foreign ones anyway, and assessed them and kept records of them. And so that was an important source for this paper, particularly of the port records. But they're not on microfilm either. They're in record groups of 36. So I do quite a bit of work at the National Archives for this. And another source is newspapers, and the local newspapers are going to be very interested in what's going on in the way of commerce and economic activity. And the Daily Alta California, San Francisco, which is on microfilm, and I think we have a copy here. And then the Russian newspaper, and this was another surprise, the Kommercheskaya Gazeta, St. Petersburg economic newspaper of the 19th century. It runs practically all the way through the 19th century. And I happened to have a year in Helsinki where I could access a full run of the Kommercheskaya Gazeta, and they were very convenient. They would just haul it out as I needed it, and I went through most of it, which covers a lot of other stuff besides San Francisco, but mostly pertaining to economic activity of Russia during this period. I think it's much neglected. I don't know many people who have used that newspaper for 19th century Russian history. Joseph Nico, well, I only knew him because a book was in the collection of the Sanders papers. I guess it's lost now, and it's rare. Published in Yokohama in English in 1890. Why did it? Well, it so happened this young Japanese boy, I think he was 15 or 16 at the time, was a shipwreck survivor. And Sanders knew about him as collector of the port. He surfaced in San Francisco, and Sanders took him under his wing. And so there's quite a bit in that book, Narrative of Japanese, about his Sanders, when he went to St. Petersburg, took this Japanese boy with him and put him in school in Baltimore, in a Catholic school. That's how he got the name Joseph, I think. He was baptized in the Catholic Church as a result of this. And anyway, there was some interesting information, and he later became a prominent newspaper publisher in Japan. And so that's the rest of his story. So anyway, that's the sources that were involved in this. Now I'm going to revert back to a more formal material. And another thing that I had discovered from a Russian source, a Russian scholar, who last I knew was in his 90s, and I doubt if he's still living, who wrote a book about Russian Latin American relations. Latin American relations included Spain, and he was one of the leading Russian scholars of Spanish history in the 20th century, and wrote a book about that, based on Russian records, largely. Russian records being the Russian ambassador to Spain. And the Spanish were very active in this whole area, San Francisco. And I discovered the Battle of Nootka Sound. Well, it wasn't a battle, but it was a face-off between the British fleet and the Spanish fleet off the coast of Vancouver Island. And that's where Nootka Sound is. And they met there, and the Spanish decided to retreat. And nothing was left of the battle except some place names on the map. The commanders of the fleets, the two fleets, were Vancouver and Bodega. And you find those place names along there. What was the result of this? The Spanish ambassador is picking this up and saying, hey, something's going on out there. There's a vacuum. And we know we're interested in this because we already have fur hunting parties in the area over there. No settlements yet. But Catherine the Great sees this and promotes, hey, we got to get there. We got to do this. And that, I think, was a beginning, really a solid push by the Russian government to get into Alaska, to get into North America. And the first settlement is 1795 in Kodiak, and the charter of the Russian America Company comes soon after that. And then the settlement in Sitka, it was called New Archangel at the time. That was the Russian name. Sitka is the Alaskan name the Americans adopted. And Rozanov, who was quite a pioneer in this whole business, goes down to Monterey, California, established connections with the Spanish, puts his foot in the door, you might say, for the establishment of Fort Ross in California. So the Russians are there already now in 1812. And the sale of Fort Ross, that's as far as I'm going to go with this chronology, but that sets up precedents of Russians being involved and actually selling too when they need to. Now there's the rest of the chronology. Gold rush in Northern California, the San Francisco boom. Within a year, San Francisco jumps from about 1,000 to 50,000. That's a big jump to handle in population. The first ice delivery in 1852 to the American-Russian Commercial Company that Sanders is president of. I've got in the paper a list of, in a footnote actually, a list of the stockholders, and they represent who's who of the San Francisco business world. I can tell that from my reading of newspapers and so on. So there's a nice delivery. Well, I'm going to make this, I want to allow plenty of time for discussion. It's not easy just getting ice and bringing it to San Francisco. You've got to have a system and an enterprise. It involves entrepreneurship. And the Russians are looking for new possibilities because the fur trade has been going down. And from 1840 to 1950, it declines by 50%, half down. It's because of the depletion of the resource, the otter, sea otter, going down, just over-exploiting it, the resource, and some decline in desire and competition. We were settling beaver and so on. The fur trade in America, the Astor Company is getting involved, and they're established in Oregon and Washington. The American expansion in those areas is making a big difference in the Russian possibilities. Another thing that I think comes into play is the China trade, the American China trade, which was worked with the Russian exports of fur to China, because it was often the New England Bostonians who carried the furs from Alaska to China, to Canton, during the early part of the 19th century. But that's been displaced, the fur trade, by whaling. Those New England ships are now going out to get whales in the same waters. Well, not quite. But most of it's coming from the Sea of Okhotsk, the big primary whaling area. There's an interesting little story connected with another John D. Wolfe, who was from Rhode Island. I found out about him when I was in Rhode Island. Bristol, who was sent out with a ship in 1805 to trade. He was sent out by his father. That's the way you did things those days. A younger son, you just sent him out with a ship, see what he could do. He ended up in Alaska, going all the way around, and selling his ship to Juneau, because the Russian American Company didn't have a ship, and they needed one. And so that's the ship that Rozanov took down to California, to Monterey. And John D. Wolfe, though, had to collect for the ship in St. Petersburg. They didn't have cash in Alaska at the time. And so he goes off in a small Russian ship, just a rowboat, basically, across the Sea of Okhotsk, and then across Siberia all the way. It took him 2 years to get back to Boston. But anyway, because he was caught during the Napoleonic Wars, in part, he had to spend a year in St. Petersburg. But when he went across the Sea of Okhotsk, getting to Siberia, he had an encounter, which he describes. He'd written his journal. He had a long autobiography, which is a very rare book, which I found and we used. And he tells his story. He was inspired to tell the story. Well, back up. He tells the story of an encounter with an albino whale. Where is this going? Moby Dick. Turns out his nephew was Herman Melville. They were the origins of Moby Dick. Well, anyway. Okay. Had to throw that one in. The ice business becomes a main business in this story. And other commodities go into the picture. I have the very big, clear picture of ice. It's clear ice. No. Get back here. Ships at sea. I also want to mention that another inspiration for me is ships. Somehow I just like ships. And it may be because there was another John Neff, his grandson, who was my cousin, who lived across the fence. You walk through the woods to get there, who was somewhat older, and I was always in his shadow, you might say, liked him, and followed his career, which led from the high school I attended, a little high school, much ahead of me, to Annapolis, to graduation there in 1941, assignment to Pearl Harbor that summer. He was there on a destroyer. The Japanese weren't very interested in destroyers. They were going after the big ships. He survived, went on to serve on a destroyer through World War II, ended up commanding a destroyer and a whole career in the Navy. I always liked that, and I talked to him sometimes about why he went to the Navy from this farm in Indiana, which had no water around it. Well, it did have a river, small river, but that's not a sea. And he said, well, I was just being caught on land, entrapped by land all around. I was intrigued by the sea. And I think I had some of that myself. So another thing was that the ships were involved in this whole process. The Bacchus was the first one. That rang a bell too, because the ice was cooling drinks, liquor, and wine maybe too. The first tonnage of ice, 300 tons, came on the Bacchus in 1852. And then the other ships came into it. The Zenobia was one of the largest one, 900 tons. The larger the ship, the better. And of course, you can't use a steamship for ice. It'll all melt before you get there. You got to have it packed, a lot of it together, to avoid meltage for a long voyage. Now it's 1,500 miles from Sitka to San Francisco, so it's a good voyage. It's not going to get there overnight on a sailing ship. And these are all sailing ships. The Zenobia was owned by the American-Russian Commercial Company. The Kodiak, as you might guess, is owned by the Russian-American Company. The X's on this map indicated loss, shipwreck. They sank. They're gone in this picture. One of the other veterans, the Cian, was an American ship that was sold to the Russians and became the Nakhimov, named after a famous admiral in Russia. You can see the number of voyages there that they made. So there's a lot of ice going down to San Francisco. The demand is going up as the population goes up. Now, you might pause for a minute that there is ice in California. It's right up there in the mountains. Why not bring it down? Well, you have to haul it in a wagon. Again, you're not going to get much down there on a long haul. Not until later. And then there's the Tsaritsa. I love the Tsaritsa. This was a classic Yankee clipper. You couldn't get more classic than the Tsaritsa, which was built in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And it was originally named the Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, sold to the Russian-American Company in Hamburg because the Russian-American Company knew that they could get more money by hauling the ice. They were paid for that. And this is 1,200 tons. This is a big ship. Well, it didn't last too long in the business. But it was, not only is the Yankee Clipper big, but it's fast. It made 4 trips in 1 year there. You can see the years. But 4 of them were in 1 year. Unfortunately, the final year, in 61, the final voyage, and pulling it out of the harbor. Now, a big ship, you can't just put the sails up and go. You got to get out in the open water. And so it was being towed out by a steamship, tugboat, and it was pulled onto rocks. Well, badly pulled onto rocks. Now, add a little footnote to that. It so happened that the 20-year charter of the Russian America Company was expiring in 1862. It had run for that period. And in preparation for the renewal of the charter, which had to be done by the government, it was a government act which gave them the monopoly rights over Alaska. They sent out inspectors to look at what was going on there. And the inspectors were from the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Navy. Minister of Navy was Grand Duke Constantine. He's not very fond of the Russian America Company. It stands in his way. What his way is to develop Far Eastern resources, Vladivostok. He wants to put resources there, not in Alaska. This inspector from the Ministry of Navy is watching the Tsaritsa being pulled onto the rocks. Now, that's not going to sink, loaded with ice, right? It has to be towed, though, to San Francisco for repairs. And that's going to be expensive, the whole business. And he writes this up. It's in the reports, published. And the government's decision is we're not going to renew it for another 20 years, only 1 year at a time. They're ready to sell right then. Anyway, the Tsaritsa does come back into service. It's still Russian. And what does it do? Its final voyage for the Russian America Company is to haul the remains of the company back to St. Petersburg in 1867. The summer of 1867, the rest of Russian America departs. That is, the Russians and any of the properties they have there are sold. Well, that's not quite true. There's a big auction. They have a local auction, basically, to sell off what's left after the sale to America. And so the Tsaritsa does make a voyage, and I think I remember reading somewhere that it remains in service until 1914. Sailing ships were still valuable to haul cargo long distance. You know, cargo on steamships is expensive. You have to buy coal. You don't have to buy wind. So that they're still competitive. And the Yankee clippers, a number of them survived until World War I anyway. Another thing about, being ready to sell. Another piece of the information that Golovin, Pavel Golovin, is the Ministry of Navy's inspector there, and whose best friend is Alexander Rimsky-Korsakov, who's the brother of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, the composer, and has naval connections. So these are nobility of naval background. And he sees what's going on. Another person that's very much into the picture from the beginning, in fact, of promoting this ice trade is Peter Kostromytnov, who is the Russian America agent in California, in San Francisco, and also Russian consul in San Francisco because of the commerce that's created. What I don't have a good handle on, because it's not so much in the records, or I didn't pay enough attention to it, is the what's going to Alaska from San Francisco. Quite a bit is going that way. And just to give you an example, Russians overdo things. They don't buy American boots in World War I because they arrested the agent of the company that manufactured those boots that they were trying to get. They shoot themselves in the foot without the protection of American boot. And this is another case of overdoing things. Here's a record of the imports. This is from the Russian source. Imports in 1855. The Crimean War is going on. They bought in San Francisco 740 gallons of wine, 3,000 flasks of rum, cognac, brandy, and whiskey, 1,800 pounds of coffee, 50,000 Manila cigars, and 5,400 pounds of tea. Now think about that for a minute. The Russian-American company is a tea company back home because they were selling furs to Alaska in trade for tea and then selling tea. But in Alaska, they're buying tea from America. But this is absurd. I mean, a country buying all this luxury stuff. And also, of course, clothing, shoes, flour, sugar, and salt. Basic things.
Did that stay though in Alaska?
What is happening here is that Alaska during this time, because of the shipping going back and forth, 4,000 tons average a year. And that list of ships I showed is only the peak of the group. There are 9 ships a year going back and forth. Most of them just one voyage or two. They're chartered vessels doing most of the hauling. What is really happening is that Alaska is sliding toward America on ice. And it's already part of America commercially. It's in the domain. So the decision they can't sell Alaska to America in 1862. You know why. There's a war going on. And we're busy with that. And to buy Alaska in the middle of the war would not look very good. So they have to wait till the war is over. And the Russians know that. And they're not going to sell it to the English. So the only buyer in the Russian mind is going to be the United States. And so the decision to sell Alaska, to really get down to the bare bones and deal with it, is taken in 1866 in December on the Russian side, and on the American side it's in March of 67 when you get Congress to pass the appropriations bill that includes the purchase of Alaska. Okay, but that's enough, I think.